Talking with Zak Stein today, a PhD in psychology of sorts, master of many things. We've known each other for like 4 years, basically. A lot of behind the scenes communication, which is pretty helpful and constructive, but now we're going public and we're going to try to keep it alive and interesting. I got a lot of talking points here, but we're going to kind of have a free roaming conversation. I've listened to lots of your podcasts and interviews and stuff. And obviously, and one thing that doesn't come up very much is politics, but we've talked about that a lot. So why don't you tell me and whoever's listening why Bernie Sanders was the best candidate? And that's a huge missed opportunity for all the people who kind of sat on the fence or played contrarian to that movement. And of course, as things change and Bernie's, adapting and changed his role, the movement still matters, but the kind of electoral opportunity has passed. So I'd like to hear your view and kind of interpolation of these ideas, because like you don't talk politics publicly too much, but I think you have a great take.
Well, man, cool. Yeah, no, it's been 4 years. Wow, it's been that long. Yeah, I remember first encountering you on the metamodern listserv, and then reading your basically everything on your Medium page, and enjoying the movie, reaching out, and yeah, just I think consistent and constructive communication. A lot of our talk has been about what the fuck is wrong with the left, and then what the fuck is wrong with some of these communities who are like integral community, apologizing for capitalism and flirting with the right in some very unconstructive ways. And so yeah, Bernie Sanders, I live in Vermont, and so Bernie Sanders is like owns $1 million house about an hour from me, and he was by far, from a personality assessment standpoint, in terms of like people, Sanders is one of the few kind of real organic intellectual politicians who's actually doing politics in the kind of theatrical sense of like big stage politics. And so in that sense, it was hard for me not to just be like, well, he's the most responsible, clearest thinking, least captured. And I think, so for me, that was just on the basis of his person. Now, do I agree with all the policies? I haven't looked close enough to know exactly if I agree with all the policies. But I certainly agreed more with them than I agreed with many of the other ones, especially in realms of education, student loan, debt, and things of that nature, which I know well, those areas of policy. And so I think the other thing worth saying here, because, just needs to be said, is that, the situation that happened with Sanders, I think, shows more than anything else the moral bankruptcy of the Democratic Party. I mean, so it's like people say blue no matter what or whatever, blue no matter who, but you're kind of like, whoa, like, look at what happened here. Like the lying, the deceit, the obvious kind of power play. So that I think is one of the things that sent me metapolitical. It like sent me into seeing the entire kind of like theatrics and entertainment of kind of big presidential politics as actually being somehow a distraction. And so that was, in a sense, the way I reacted to the fact that there was no way Sanders could be anything like a presidential candidate, that they feared him and more than they feared Trump. And that's important to know, and that they were willing to do basically anything to stop him, I think is also worth knowing, as far as what the Democrats are willing to do. as if they're innocent. And they wouldn't use violence and coercion and thievery and lying. No, both sides are playing power politics. And that just has to be recognized up front, that there's not a good side and a bad side, that there's just these incredibly powerful political machines with very, very abstract, to use your terminology, kind of like teleological, kind of like trajectories. And so that's why I'm super hesitant to kind of weigh in on that spectacle in the detail, because I think that most of what we think is the detail and what gets discussed, it's put there very strategically in front of us for particular reasons, in particular kind of medium of communication, which is to say it's simulation. It's not actual politics. And Sanders was potentially trying to do actual politics, which is why I didn't want him there.
Yeah.
So that would be my like 2 minutes on that.
Yeah, that's great. And I've been a big advocate, sort of surrogate supporter, all those things for Bernie, both times. And I'm always trying to clarify too for people internally that I don't necessarily expect, even if we had a consensus, to sway the election, right? Because there's a lot of kind of just skepticism and cynicism around that. But what I've been trying to do is at least build some sort of a consensus around the idea that Bernie's politics was the bare minimum that we need, and everyone else is kind of full of it. And it's a double tragedy that it happened twice in a row, right? So the 2016 election was historic, and like nobody knew what was going to happen. There was obviously the Clinton establishment had lots of power, but it came very close, and there was this kind of what if and the kind of just a potential, the Overton window seemed to open a little bit, especially when that little bird landed on Bernie's podium. These symbolic things we cling to, whether they're accurate or not. The data was showing enormous support for Sanders and for the movement, and it's always been about the actual organic movements for me too. As a political sociologist, I'm looking to that, right? And the people aren't always correct. Voters can be catastrophically wrong, but in this case, as you say, he's an authentic person and politician and organic intellectual. So it was a timing thing. It was a moment thing. And it's okay to have skepticism, but I was trying to urge smart people to do the right thing. And in 2016, there was almost more unity than there was in 2020 for various factors. The culture war intensified with the intellectual dark web and things like that. And then there was a lot more players on the field, right? Something like 25 candidates at one point were taking up space and votes away from Bernie. And then of course Biden, the entire campaign, he just sort of sat in the background, just drifted on the magic carpet of the DNC. And now here we are. It's just a constant shit show, and I'm still at this kind of impasse where I'm trying to convince at least, ostensibly intelligent people in these adjacent communities that we need to get on the same page. We need to get on the same book and on the same page, because we have some sort of, gestalt understanding of a meta crisis, a long time coming and emerging now. But, all the intellectual competition and infighting is part of the meta crisis, and it's killing us. So, we can't avoid serious intellectual engagement and the political complications and ramifications of that, I think. So maybe we can pivot from this to the information ecology, the media ecologies. That's something you wanted to talk about.
Shut my window here, hold on. Yeah, I mean, here we are, right? I mean, and it's like, I agree. There was a moment there when the bird landed on Sanders' podium, where there was like a rift in the simulation, because that couldn't be arranged. And I heard some rumor, I don't know if it's true, that Hillary Clinton was trying to train a bird to do that for her, but it would be hard to accomplish that. And but I don't think there was ever any chance. Like, I'm cynical about the Democratic Party, and I'm cynical about the way voting works now in general, because of the nature of micro-targeted political advertisements on social media, which have basically instituted behind everyone's back a new form of coercion. Like, we've known physical violence for a long time, and we've known overt indoctrination for some time. But this covert, secret indoctrination done through customization of social media news feeds and micro-targeted political advertisements, make no mistake, it's coercion. And if people are being coerced to vote in particular ways, and they're not making a free choice, then they're not actually voting. And democracy is about educating people into greater and more complex forms of choice making. It's not about disabling choice and basically overriding the unforced force of the better argument and like locking in through causal mechanisms the outcome of an election. And so, Cambridge Analytica, the fact that we know about it means that there's stuff going on that we don't know about. And they were in the business of election management internationally, and were the thing that got Trump elected. And so that happened in 2016. You got to think about what's happening right now. And so that's, I think, again, like a metapolitical thing. It's like not about which side. It's about what the fuck both sides are doing to all sides in this game of power. And the question, and it's kind of not a great question, of how could the election take place in such a way, even right now in the current conditions, in which it's seen as legitimate? Very important question. Because the future of democracy hinges upon it. And the breakdown of public culture has made it so that it's hard, actually, for me to imagine a scenario where 25 to 30% of the population doesn't think that the election, no matter which way it goes, is illegitimate. So that's the case. But there's more to say about the nature of the social media environment and the micro-targeted political advertisements, which we can get to maybe later. But to me, that's actually the most important political thing that's happening right now. It's the condition for the possibility of the presidential election right now, which means that it's a metapolitical node, and it ends up being an economic node more than anything else, because it's the linchpin of the business models of Google, Facebook, etc. Right? So that's like full stop. Like, if you're fucking drooling rabid on either side, you've been completely captured. And the state of discourse, if you even want to call it discourse, on social media about politics is abysmal, and the journalists are addicted to it. And Twitter is now, more or less determining what is speech or not. So it's a little bit of a dark age situation, it feels to me, in the realm of the political. So I wonder where the actual politics is happening. It's happening around the micro-targeted political advertisement. It's happening around the nature of the controls around the pandemic, and probably in a few other echelons of multinational finance and things of that nature. So this is why the presidential election doesn't particularly interest me. Now, it's extremely important, but to understand what's really taking place, you can't just focus on the candidates and what they're saying at all. And you can't get locked into 24-hour news cycle social media addiction and think that that's anything like actual political analysis.
There's a couple directions I want to go with that. One is to kind of clarify to you and and challenge you a bit with the online stuff is that a lot of the leftist enclaves or discourses are actually quite sensible and cogent, but they don't get as much amplification. And there's just a lot happening that it's easy to tune out if you're either off social media or if you're on social media and you are sucked into other rabbit holes, right? So the spaces that I've participated in, like Game B and Emerge and intellectual dark web type stuff, like they have different kind of constituencies that they're for the most part anti-left, right? So there's no overlap in the discourses, and I do like get a lot of benefit out of social media because of the way that I use it, kind of as a researcher and strategically. And there's a lot of good journalists doing good work, and they just don't get as much kind of amplification. So I wanted to kind of just foreground that, but then also pivot to like the mainstream media institutions, which are just all horrendous, and it speaks to the crisis of elitism, you could say in some ways, because all these people, whether it's Barry Weiss working at the New York Times or Hillary Clinton herself, like a whole spectrum of kind of bourgeois snobs, they're actively creating this problem, whether they win or lose too, right? And that's the irony of all the DNC machinations, is that they still lost to Trump. So that should have told them that there's some deep crisis and that there's something wrong, but they didn't change their ways. So with wanted to just bring up the letter thing from Harper's, because it was only a week ago, but it caused a lot of controversy, and there was a lot of good critiques of it that came out. And again, it's like, okay, do those critiques reach mass audiences that the letter reached in the first place? And the main takeaway from it is just that it was so tone deaf and hypocritical, because many people on the list. Oh, it was just an open letter with like 50 signatories or whatever that Harper's published, that was like, free speech good, like let's open debate good, Right. And it's kind of a passive aggressive kind of reaction to cancel culture, right? And so these people like Steven Pinker and Barry Weiss, who were signatories, are just whining because they get criticized, and they get criticized because they have bad takes. But then the letter also had signatories like Noam Chomsky, because it's just a basic endorsement for the principle of free speech and open debate. But where is the fucking free speech and open debate, right? The New York Times has not been hosting that at any point in its existence. And so it's just totally hypocritical. And, so to pivot from that to a point I said to you before we recorded, is like, there's kind of open fascism in the streets now, with like unmarked police vehicles, like just picking up protesters and Antifa people and just, disappearing them. And, maybe they're released later, but it's still a kind of extrajudicial, like very terrorizing practice. And of course, so you have all these free speech pundits whining 1 week about, being criticized. And then like, they're silent on this kind of stuff. So there's a kind of deep pathology in the media, and we could reduce it to the profit motive if we want, but I think just the systemically individuals like these writers and journalists, they're just, I think they've lost their mind, because we even saw kind of the police state under Obama, right? So this isn't a kind of thing exclusive to Trump. But it seems like everything that we're doing, and I extend my critique to these sense-making communities, but everything we're doing is adding to the problem. It's compounding and multiplying the problem. And I think your research is good at finding strategic points of leverage to kind of draw down that. And I think the same way. But I think we've got to do much better to start reversing those trends. And like speaking out is one kind of avenue for that, but I think we need more kind of intellectual solidarity. over these issues.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the frightening displays of police power, and also the frightening displays of protest and riot. And so there's definitely a social intensity that is taking place that reminds me of what Wilhelm Reich wrote about in The Mass Psychology of Fascism, basically, which is my way in. When you're saying the root of the problem, it's actually not profit motive, it's deeper than that. It's at the level of character structure and the nature of basic human reciprocity in socialization. And so, like, these are the lever points I look for, are always educational, that the root of the issue is the human, and specifically the developing human, like the growing, being socialized, being culturated human. And so when you look at the nature of socialization in kind of digital media landscapes, right, that we have a generation who have been raised and then adults who've been kind of re-educated into these forms of communication that end up being almost 100% strategic. And what I mean by that is that it's very difficult to tell the difference between, first of all, a bot and a human, but then it's even more difficult sometimes to tell the difference between speech that's strategically motivated and speech that's commercially motivated and speech that's offered with the intention of communication and mutual understanding, right? So micro-targeted political advertising is not speech offered for mutual understanding. It's strategic speech. And then so much of social media discourse is strategic. It's trying to be as coercive and as it can possibly be. And there is reasonable stuff out there, like you're saying, but then you also say, but they don't get seen. And so that's a huge issue. And so, but what it means is that we are kind of like, just like an addict blows out dopamine cycles, we're blowing out certain forms of empathy and creating holes in the character structure for fascism to get in, basically, on both sides. It's quite remarkable. And so you end up getting, an intentional and explicit diversion away from discourse into going meta or going political, in the sense of like resorting to force or coercion. And you also get a misdirection of what might be called the properly operating kind of pleasure centers, so that the kinds of pleasures that spontaneously come from free exchange of ideas and deepening of mutual understanding are not available. So you begin to get pleasure out of basically scapegoating and inflicting pain. So there becomes a communicative sadism that sets in when the kind of natural, normal functioning of communicative kind of pleasure that comes from just reaching mutual understanding and overcoming misunderstanding and difference. And you feel, if you have a close relationship and there's a misunderstanding and you resolve it, you're like, oh, that's fucking nice. If that never happens, you never get that. If you never get that sense, then you don't know how to find that pleasure, but you need to find pleasure in communication. So you end up going into basically a kind of communicative sadism, where the pleasure you get is from inflicting a kind of pain in the other, usually through a kind of like flouting reason, which is to say, doing things that are demonstrably not in the interest of reaching communication, and doing things that are also sometimes just demonstrably not true. So lying or open misinformation and things of that nature. And so this is my explanation for the kind of rising tide of fascism. It's both the economic situation, at least the raw economics, and the systematically distorted communication that is propagated in these environments of social media, which are beating out the schools and the dinner table as the main effect in socialization now. So the screens won, schools lost, and then when the pandemic hit, that got doubled down on. And so what this means is, yeah, we are trying to run a society with a bunch of people who are, ourselves included in many ways, warped by these contemporary conditions of socialization. And so that means the work that needs to be done is to find ways to heal the psyche through fixing communication, something like that.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I sound like a critical theorist, right? Trying to psychoanalyze society and putting
Nothing wrong with that.
right, putting society on the couch. But I'm saying, like, we've known this. Like, this is
Yeah.
Eros and civilization, and
Yeah.
Adorno and Horkheimer and the authoritarian personality, which is worth looking at these days too. So I'm not ruling out that there are pressing economic factors that are leading to this, but I am saying that he is the human heart and the integrity of the psyche, and we don't have socialization and culture that allow us to hold that integrity, and then we're less than we should be as people to one another, basically.
Yeah, I completely agree. And my critiques, as I said, they extend to these adjacent communities. I don't think they're exempt. Like they have more subtle forms, right? But to me, it's very obvious because there's a kind of fetishization of communication modalities, conversational practices. But then it clearly falls apart when there's one or another kind of anomaly introduced, like some information that the person can't process, or a kind of ad hominem critique or whatever. But it's just it's ironic that there's a kind of fetishization around that, like they're constructing some sort of advanced communication, but there's still a breakdown on some basic levels, like being able to talk about Marxism in an academic sense, for example. If that's off the table, then we have no common ground. and so, or the Bernie movement, for that matter, just more broadly, like it's a kind of post-capitalist kind of meta progressive movement, because it's not, the typical progressivism has kind of been co-opted, as we know. It's kind of exhausted itself. So there's really a crisis within the crisis, as I've been saying for like a couple years. And a lot of these communities too, it's very capitalist realist, which is just, again, super ironic, because we're supposed to know these things already as a kind of collective, and their advice to people like me would be to, like, pull your bootstraps up, which is just totally neither here nor there. So I'm like proposing more advanced ideas like auto critique and consensus building that actually kind of sharpen the critique and kind of iteratively would get us closer to truth. And I've been attacked by lots of people, but at the end of the day, I don't block anybody. And so when other people foreclose avenues of communication, they're committing precisely these kinds of fallacies we're talking about on a deep level, because there's just multiple kind of knock-on effects from doing that. But first and foremost is you exclude another channel of information, right? And I'm not saying blocking is not justified in the case of, like, you have like a stalker or some kind of like extreme ideologue, but in good faith dialogue, you should just never do that. I talked with a couple reactionaries last week, over the past week, over Zoom, and what you find immediately is that, like, you can understand each other better in real time, and you can have confrontation still, but it can be de-escalated in real time, right? So it doesn't just
Right.
have a snowball effect, right? So this is all pretty obvious and transparent to me, but it's not obvious to a lot of the hypocrites in these emerge or game B or intellectual dark web or integral as well communities. So how do we make that conversation more public and foreground that? I mean, we're doing it right now, but What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, my first thought is like blocking is not, I mean, I know the term, but it's not a part of my life because I'm not on social media. And so whenever I hear people say like, oh, my relationship with this person was ruined because of interactions over social media, I'm like, well, what's the problem? Is it you guys, or is it the fact you're trying to use social media to communicate and publicly argue with one another? And it's literally designed to make you do that, and to draw more attention to the conversation through sparking polarization. And in certain contexts, it even involves, like I said, micro-targeting, algorithmically, bot-produced text. Something like a third of discourse on Facebook during the 2016 presidential election was not human. So I'm just like, yeah, if you're having problems communicating with people on social media, then you're using social media. And so my first people there continues to be the same kind of polarization. I may have broken up there.
Yeah, a little bit.
So, but what I was saying is basically, yeah, it's gonna get worse if you just continue to communicate with people on social media. It just is. But if you drop out of that into long form conversations, non-public, like just talking without too much time constrained and open, maybe with a third person who's a helpful and observant communicator, then see how bad it gets.
Yeah.
Because I think we're tricked into thinking the simulation of people we encounter on social media are the people, when they're not. I mean, we know the things designed for strategic presentation of self, and we know the things designed to capture the regulation of self-esteem through proxied personas in social media. So that means that it's an environment that's made to make us project inaccurate things about other people, I believe. So yeah, get out of that space if you want to get into any kind of collaborative space, and maybe get out of it if you want to stay sane.
I'm gonna push back because
Of course,
you've given,
because you're addicted to social media.
No. Well, I mean, if that were true, that's one thing. But if it's not, then what does that say about your projection on me, right? Because I've also made a case, yeah. but so we've talked about this before, and I only want to push back in the sense that of course it's true for most people, and even in these cases I'm talking about, it has an effect as well. But some of these people carry with them the same anti-intellectual problems offline, and I can even like, I'm not going to go deep into naming names, but I've critiqued a lot of people publicly, right? And so Jonathan Rowson is one of those people. I had a close working relationship with him for a year, and social media wasn't a factor in us misunderstanding or understanding each other. It probably was to some degree, because we use it differently, like we really do. But we had many live conversations, and so there's something else going on there besides social media. So I just want to compartmentalize that issue as something different. I don't want to let it be reduced to that, because it kind of lets people off the hook. And it's one of many factors, right? And it's a multiplier for sure, but the root cause that I'm getting at is, in some of these people's thinking and in their professional lives and their commitments, that creates kind of trade-offs and conflicts. But all of that aside, I think there are attitudes and practices and research literacy that people can have to work towards a convergence, right? And consensus building is one of those practices. And as I say in my article, it's going to take investment, it's going to take commitment. It doesn't just happen, and nothing like it is happening, by the way. Nothing even close, right? And think tanks and institutions that actually have the capacity and the finances to do this kind of thing, they're not doing anything like it either. nevertheless, there always is various types of consensuses being built, right? The case in point, the neoliberal consensus from the 1970s. That's not what we want to try to do now. We don't want to have another kind of consensus like that. We want to have an auto critique of that. And of course, at the same time, there was a kind of future awareness of the potential inadequacy of these types of things. But we need to build consensus around things like the meta crisis, around things like your work, for example, because I think it really speaks for itself. I think there's a lot of kind of irreproachable ideas in there. And if we don't get people to the table to come to a mutual understanding, then people are co-opting each other's work. It's all piecemeal and fragmented, and there's just a lot of bullshit. And I don't think we're going to make it if we don't attempt kind of these dramatic metamodern gestures.
I agree with the last statement. We need dramatic metamodern gestures, for sure. Jonathan Rawson's a good friend of mine, and it saddens me that you guys have had difficulties. And I'm not sure this is exactly the place to discuss that at all, given that it's was a professional relationship. I'm not super interested.
We don't have to. I bring it up in part because he's and this isn't a critique of him necessarily or to his credit, but he's not doing anything about it, and so that's on him because I'm doing something about it, and I stand by everything I've written and said publicly because it's actually kind of legitimate criticism, and it comes from an authentic place of all being betrayed. And if when people have problems, they can solve them. This is easily solvable. A lot of the problems that we're dealing with are easily solvable. So that's the only reason I bring it up. I'm just tired of hearing excuses from people that really they're nothing more than excuses. I'm sure they have rationales on a deeper level that are outside of my scope, but these are really solvable problems. And so when we're all diverging on different projects, whether it's doing a contract for somebody else or self-promotion, we're undermining our own purposes, our own trajectories to converge on this meta crisis. And at the end of the day, it makes us all look ridiculous. And if I don't say it, somebody else is going to. So, one of the things that I found fascinating about, learning about the kind of schism in integral, because I didn't come up through an integral community, is just that this stuff happens. And then, people kind of just let it happen. They let it happen. Ken Wilber has a lot of power in his position too, to actually do something different. And he doesn't. He just goes and does the same thing and stays in his safe bubble. And, I don't want to critique all these people, right? But at a certain point, I'm obligated. And the good thing about this case of Wilbur is so many people have done it before. It's all been done to death. And I kind of come late to the party and just try to help frame and describe the fact that there is a schism and that we have to solve it. If there's any legitimacy and sincerity in these projects, then let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't particularly like the way the conversation's gone. I just don't think it's worth airing personal grievances. And then with Ken, it's people just misunderstand the severity of Ken's illness. It's people don't understand that the integral community fractured in many ways because the king abandoned the throne because he was wounded. Ken has a disease that most people die from suicide when they get it because it's so debilitating and so exhausting. And so it's you can totally criticize Ken as a theoretician, but as a leader, I think it's difficult for me now to want to do anything but basically treat Ken's work with a lot of respect, because the integral community became something that was uncontrollable. And yeah, fractured is an interesting word to use. But even then, in those days, it was like, you know, scapegoating and, you know, brand purity and marketing and a whole bunch of other shit started to set in. So yeah, you know, I don't know. I don't know exactly where
Yeah.
you're going, except to say that, like, wouldn't it be great if contentious, competitive scholars all actually cooperated? And like, wouldn't it be great if there could be a metamodern gesture towards that kind of actually very high level kind of, you know, summit of global theory and philosophy? Like, I would love that. But again, like, as a psychologist, I'm like, of course that's not happening. Like, we're all completely distracted by social media, and in the midst of an economic crisis and a pandemic and a sham election, and
Yeah.
many people are just trying to keep their heads above water financially. Even people you think would be like free to be politically active and doing theory and all this other stuff, and you'd like to see more in the game, are actually in very complex personal situations because of the
Yeah.
unraveling of, at the microstructure of the unraveling of the capitalist world system here. Is
and
that there's
I don't doubt
universal
that.
precarity. Not
Right.
universal precarity, but there's a widely dispersed precarity, and that's going to be growing.
Yeah. Well, you and I both are in sort of situations like that, right? So it's personal for both of us. And I respect other people's issues and boundaries, but where it becomes not interesting is not the right word, but just really, really tragic is that, you know, a lot of people are in positions of power, regardless of their personal life, where they can help straighten things out. You know, lots of rich people, lots of entrepreneurs, lots of, you know, public thinkers, uh, case in point, any of these intellectual dark web people. Um, and like Jeff Bezos, he's worth like $170 billion now. And I mean, worth isn't the right word either. He's not worth anything. He just has a lot of money. But just the hypocrisy and the richness of it all. It's just pure anti-intellectual. We're an anti-intellectual civilization, despite the fact that we foster genius and send things into space and cure diseases. We've done very little as a society to heal the body politic, right? And I mean, this is where I start to just get really sick of the whole field of psychology too, because I talked with John Vervaeke about this a little bit, just the friction between the fields of psychology and sociology.
Then you're doing bad psychology. If you're a psychologist
Yeah,
who feels friction with sociology, then you're just a bad psychologist.
yeah,
And
exactly.
vice versa, of course. If you're a sociologist
Yeah,
who wants
sure.
nothing to do with psychology, then you're just a bad sociologist. I mean, this, like Wilhelm Reich's book, just to mention again, Mass Psychology of Fascism, very hard to tell where sociology begins and psychology ends there. And he's weaving in like really good Marxist meta-economic analyses and microeconomic analyses at the level of labor exploitation and things of that nature. So yeah, I get it. It sucks. That's why I left the academy. In part was because there was an implicit and expected ethnocentrism of the disciplines, to use Donald Campbell's phrase, where you were expected to basically have animosity towards adjacent fields. So yeah, but you were going to say something about my psychological analysis of the situation being not enough.
Well, not yours specifically, but just broadly, these trends, the psychologism, the reductionism to psychology, and I was trying to. Oh yeah, so one point I wanted to make was just from my anti-intellectualism article. There's a really great part there about kind of the duty of people to speak up if they have the capacity to. Right, just the difference that makes. And so the example that I drew from one of these books was the Dreyfus affair. This is over a century ago, but to do with a kind of it's a very, very complex historical event, but basically this maybe you know about it, but this military officer was kind of smeared, and it became kind of judged in the court of public opinion. And so it became this like epistemic crisis of sorts. And a writer, you know, used his ability and his power and his safety, because he was able to get out of the country, but still write about it, to kind of help shape public opinion, right, more responsibly. And so this is the role of public intellectuals to do. And the ethical principle there is that they should always do that, always speak up to the level of your capacity, right? And even sometimes go beyond if you can or if you have to. And what we see just generally is the opposite. It's a lot of insulation, and kind of, you know, self-protection, and all these defense mechanisms pop up and go, oh, I can't do that. And, you know, especially with austerity and everybody working harder for lower wages, right? Regardless of where you are in the strata of society, it's probably going to feel that way. There's, you know, there's that pull to, you know, there's that inherent tension in, well, do I do the right thing, or do I collect my paycheck? Or, you know, how big is the gap there, right? And for different people, it's different degrees, but it creates a kind of systemic cognitive dissonance where, you know, and to the extent people are actually incentivized to say kind of provocative things and the kind of, you know, status quo establishment type things. It goes back to the New York Times and people like Barry Weiss, right? They just write ridiculous op-eds and then expect not to be challenged for it. And so they think they're taking a risk, but they're not speaking up for the oppressed or the downtrodden. They're not really risking anything substantive. So, you know, through that article, I wanted to clarify kind of what this subtle anti-intellectualism is and what the role of public intellectual is, because for the most part, it's been neglected.
I mean,
suppressed.
That's why I see a broadly distributed crisis of teacherly authority across basically all of the institutions. And again, I don't want a lot of it has to do with the informational ecologies and the digital media landscapes and social media and these kinds of things. And so it may very well be that there's plenty of those people doing exactly that. But remember, the force of reason and the power of words has been diffused, right? So like the actual space of reason has been captured, and the modalities of communication, the medium of our communication has been basically set against us in a kind of predatory, extractive way. And you have to start from there and then think, how do we get people to step up and share their voice? Because everyone thinks they're sharing their voice, right? That's the trick. That's precisely the abracadabra that takes place, which is that you think you're sharing your voice, but you're actually contributing to this massive advertisement and behavioral surplus extraction unit. And so I agree. I mean, I wish there was a space in which intellectuals could actually step into the container of teacherly authority. But that container has been systematically dismantled, again, by both sides. Like the idea that there actually is someone who knows more than you about something and should therefore teach it to you, right? It's a dangerous idea, because who gets to decide who knows more? And which tribe are you from, and which generation are you from? And even now, which race or sex are you from, makes it so that I can just diffuse the power of your teacherly authority just by virtue of a certain kind of tag. And I'm with you. But I don't blame a lack of courage. Like, I don't think it's that people aren't trying. I think that you have a lot of people trying, and you have basically a communication landscape in which certain forms of communication, specifically teacherly authority, have been depotentiated intentionally. And so that's an untenable situation from a civilizational sustainability standpoint. Because now you can't teach. Now kids are confused as hell, and you can't even pass on skills to the next generation, let alone like worldviews and shared history and shared ethics and
Yeah.
values. Because who's going to tell you what's the truth?
Yeah. No, I got a good education, and I fought for it, and it wasn't indoctrination. So I value it a lot. And there's a lot of education scholarship out there, but I really value yours because it's a kind of meta perspective, and it's very unapologetic. Like education is your attractor for a sustainable
Right.
civilization, and mine too. But I don't have that background, so I could never argue it as good as you can. But I'm interested in this idea of public sociology, for example. And that's, it's interesting because this concept arose about 15 years ago, and then it was debated for a decade.
Mm.
And
Right.
then where did it go? Where's all the sociologists? Right. And so, they need support to come forward, but they also, as academics, need to converge and need to build consensus instead of just debating. It's the dumbest thing ever when you look at it in retrospect, because now we have Trump, and it's like, think tanks are supposed to perform this role of public sociology. So is the media, and they just don't. They completely eschew it. And so, yeah, and this is where it ties back to politics. Bernie had a great education, plan through his broad platform, right? Like debt forgiveness and free college and all these things. It's not just a pipe dream. It's what we need to do. And the Green New Deal and stuff includes a jobs guarantee and sort of devolved you can have bottom up kind of entrepreneurship solutions within it, but we couldn't build the political support for it. And as I said, just because Bernie's out, these things don't go away. It still needs to happen. And you use the term miracles in your book. And a thought that occurred to me just before we started is like, why is it? It's so ironic that so many people believe in miracles in the sense of like, levitation or prayer or take your pick, kind of, healing kind of pseudoscience or religious dogma. They believe in those miracles, but they don't believe in these types of miracles. Right? The hope has been just so drained from civilization, and principally because it's been undercut by sucking the funding out of education. So why can't we just believe, and this is where it becomes a kind of spiritual question for both of us, because I do believe in the kind of necessary potential for transformation on the individual and civilizational level. We need, and this is a kind of post-secular thing too, like you talk about with Jim Rutt. We have to believe. We have to believe, but we need to stop believing in bullshit. We need to believe in your 13 social miracles, because they're actually, proven, they're pragmatic, they're generative, and it's going to start, paying dividends immediately. And so, we have these anti-intellectuals in very high places. Like John and I talked about it, like how Betsy DeVos is the education secretary. Like she's an anti-intellectual. And we need, so we need to do more kind of public sociology. That's what this is about. But then we need to leverage that into actual mass kind of political spiritual transformation. And it can't be just this, hyper pluralist kind of orgy where you have people like Biden at the forefront, because that's not authentic. At the end of the day, it's not authentic, and it's going to continue to reproduce these problems. And I'm operating within this kind of 10-year window now for the most part. Like it's 2020 and we've kind of got 10 years to collectively act on climate change. So, I've become a kind of intellectual accelerationist on these topics, because I think they need to converge. And I think we need to, do as much as possible, like in the short term for that.
Well, I wish I had a 10-year time horizon. I'm worried about November and fucking civil war. And then, the pandemic putting off cascade effects that result in like pretty bad. Talking about public sociology, you wouldn't want to run where the public sociology goes for this economic crisis that's coming, and the situation in Nigeria, for example, and the locust swarms that are coming through Africa. So yeah, I am in a sense feeling even like a shorter timeline and less sense of consensus as possible, and more a sense of like multiple competing evolutionary valley crossing things happening, like a eye of the needle kind of situation here. And yeah, I mean, it would be the role of the media to help us think about our own society. And it would be the role of school systems to do that too. So there's a, yeah, anti-intellectual is a good phrase. I talk in reductive human capital theory. I like to talk about it, you know, as contrasted to a education-centric society. But an education-centric society looks like a miracle. Sociologically speaking, it looks like a miracle. To get the basic structures of society moving in the direction of creating humans rather than moving in the direction of creating abstract capital, basically. And they're both infinite games, but one's an infinite game that can be sustained on a finite planet, namely education-centric society. You know, capital-centric society can't be run on a finite planet. But that's the game we're playing out. So yeah, there is definitely forced convergence due to crisis. I think it ends up being a question of how does that orchestration come together, and what's that constellational effect that sets in, and when, you know, and when, like, because we do know about the psyche that you can snap out of it. People do, and social systems can. Now, classically, it's been like war that forces kind of sobriety and collaboration. But there's a potential that natural catastrophe and even economic catastrophe can be like cold water on the body politic and collective psyche to wake it up. But be careful when it wakes up, because that's the other thing. So I'm with you in wanting more public sociology, and again seeking the kind of ambitious metamodern gesture that would facilitate that forced convergence in some way that's healthy.
Oh fuck, what was I gonna say? Let's go to a different point. I know you like this is related. You like Bratton, right? We've talked about him before, and I'm keeping up with that. They're doing great work out of the Strelka Institute and
Benjamin Bratton.
Yeah. One of the talks I watched recently was for a military Green New Deal, and so you know, you and I both are big proponents of demilitarization. I could go on about that for a long time, and it's a very idealistic thing, of course. And what I was going to say before was, you know, I love a good dose of cynicism, and I love when somebody's more critical than I am. So you were being kind of pessimistic there about the future, but you know, I just want to, you know, reiterate that there's great work being done, and if we can build consensus around it, that can grow. And so the military Green New Deal put into context just the, like, obviously the necessity to demilitarize in the long run, but the kind of impossibility of that in the short run. And so it actually highlighted an essential role for military to play in a kind of global sense, right? So it already implies a transition or a phasing out of military into climate resilience and response. Right. And so, you know, our job as public sociologists is to help translate those ideas in that discourse and make it more publicly salient. And, you know, one of the things I've lamented for these past years, and, you know, I mentioned earlier how good some of the discourse on the left is, but that it gets suppressed. and it fails to integrate and build a coalition. Like both elections, we came very close, but ultimately fell short of building a successful coalition that actually became dominant in the positive sense. But again, that project doesn't go away. So I think we still have to build out the left coalition, because that's where the sensible discourse is taking place. I don't think it's taking place in the center, and it's certainly not taking place on the right. And just to clarify the both sides thing, like, I know what you mean. The Chomsky for many decades has kind of described the bipolar two-party system as a kind of ruled by corporate interest, right? So that's not mystified, that's clear. But there is not an equivalence between the two sides. The Republicans are much more dangerous and politically pathological, and there's not just two sides. There's three, or there's two, and then there's the outside, right? There's this insurgent kind of alter globalization. And that is where we need to be looking and focusing. It's not sufficient to just say both sides. We need to build a coalition outside that. So, what do you think? How do you synthesize all those things? Can we transition them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying both sides. I'm saying neither side. Yeah. And it's like your equation there. It's kind of like, well, which psychopathic killer is the one I'd want to hang out with? Basically, you're saying, well, this psychopathic killer is less bad. And I'm like, well, wait a second. They're both psychopathic killers, and we know them to be. Like, for different reasons, will they do anything possible to stop the better candidate? And for different reasons, will they use micro-targeted political advertisements that are coercive? And for different reasons, they'll wield militaries and the police and Obama's drone strikes and etc. So it's not like, let's not fool ourselves about what the actual choice is.
Yeah, I just highlight that phrase because people make the both sides fallacy, which is just to say both sides while being negligent of the other side.
But I wouldn't. It's like the reasonable leftist intellectuals, of course they exist, but that's not what I'm talking about with the left. Yeah. And there are reasonable people with conservative leanings who are incredibly articulate intellectuals. I would put them together in some other category scheme that didn't involve the mass spectacle of presidential politics as the main talking point. And then I think I would also say something like, consensus isn't always the most valuable thing to seek in communication. And so this seeking of consensus at all costs is actually, and seeing it as the primary goal of communication would be to reach consensus. I'm not saying you're doing this, but I'm saying this is done. It's one of the things that undermines teacherly authority, because there's consensus, but then there's also something like reasonable meritocracy or reasonable skill differentials, where I would love to get your consensus on this problem, but I'd have to put you through specialized training for 5 years to get you to a point where you could actually understand the problem such that we could reach consensus, right? So it's not necessarily the case that you can expect consensus or even should expect consensus. What you're looking for is some way of actually weaving together something like consensus with something like meritocracy, with something like pure egalitarian plurality. That the three of those are the dynamics of communication that need to be put together in some kind of scheme, because if you just seek consensus, you'll actually not reach it, and you'll end up undermining teacher.
Just to clarify, like, it doesn't undermine what you're saying in different contexts, but to clarify, there's many different kind of versions. I'm advocating for consensus building and experimenting with different cohorts. But what I don't mean at this point, at this early stage, is the kind of broad democratic consensus. That's a bit too abstract, and we're ways off from that. So I think it can be built between two people, but the key is that there's a process to follow, right? So, and clearly this can be perverted. Like, there was a kind of neocon consensus about the Iraq war, right? That's bad. That's not a real consensus. So I'm advocating, on the micro scale.
That could be. Why isn't it a real? You're saying that people disagreed, but they were forced to pretend like they agree? I think they all agreed.
Well, they agreed, but the external parties were not even part of the process, right? And so the ultimate consensus building I'm advocating is totally inclusive of everybody's concerns, right? And so in the case of the Iraq War, you know, they violated international law, so they're breaking that kind of consensus, but they're also murdering innocent people. So they're, you know, they're completely disregarding the voices of those people in their consensus building. So it's just wrong on the face of it, at least on those two levels. But I'm trying to advocate consensus building because of the fact that we're like all of these smart sense-making communities that are adjacent have a degree of uncertainty that they acknowledge. And instead of confronting that, they're trying to ride it out. And so I think there's, you know, as I stipulate in the article, there's actually incentives to consensus building. Like if it's framed correctly, and if it's mediated correctly, because it means we're going to solve a lot of these conflicts before they start. Right. So how much have I had to complain behind the scenes about tensions between different ideologues in these spaces? And then nobody wants to do anything about it. And then eventually it blows up, or people get hurt. You know, so there's an incentive to get ahead of the problem. That's what makes us meta thinkers about these issues. We have the foresight, but we need to really, you know, again, with this metamodern gesture, which you like, we need to do a lot better, and we need to, you know, defer to each other's strengths so we can have an actual kind of resilient network, not just kind of, you know, like you said to me once privately, you know, this is pretty mundane. It's not a secret, but you said it's like herding cats, right? And I thought that was
Totally. And that's
accurate.
I mean, and to that point, I prefer the phrase like collective inquiry, or like earnest collective inquiry, to consensus seeking, because like I said, there are legitimate disagreements that don't yield consensus, but that yield growth on the parts of both parties in terms of their insight and capacity and cooperation. And so I'm all for that. I'm all for finding ways to catalyze real, sincere spaces of earnest collective inquiry. To me, when you say consensus, I think of like my time at Hampshire College, where like there was a forced or coerced consensus in circles, circles of chairs, and forced, you know, left-oriented progressive consensus that was basically you, if you don't consent, then you walk. And then I also think of consensus governance processes, which are one of the reasons, like, for example, Occupy Wall Street failed, was that you just put an undercover cop in a consensus process, and all he has to do is just be a jerk for long enough, and they can't make any decisions for their entire community because they can't reach consensus. And then, like I said, when you get to technical problems, it's like, should we really have a consensus about how to build the bridge, like in the engineering specs? We can have a consensus about its impact, perhaps, or not, on the local economy or your job and your commute and things of that nature. But yeah, so my general sense is I'm with you. I would just frame it slightly differently, and actually not go in seeking consensus, but go in seeking a space that could generate earnest collective inquiry.
Yeah, I think I'm interested, you know, I said different cohorts, but also different variations of the project itself. So there'd be ones I'd want to go into where it's a bit more open-ended, and there's ones I'd want to go into building consensus around specific things, right? Whether it's your work or my work or whatever. But, you know, then there's also examples I want to just insert something really easy to demonstrate what a consensus might feel like, right? So, you know, do we live in a heliocentric, you know, solar system? You know, yeah, we do, because we know that now. but it's also, you know, kind of galactic centric too, in a wider frame. And so, you know, it's interesting, like things like climate change or like, you know, flat Earth. Like, can you actually, you know, create a process that with things that we're certain about relatively, where you can with people's consent, transform them to a deeper level of understanding? So, you know, it's the opposite of groupthink and the opposite of cult indoctrination in the ways I'm trying to demonstrate it.
Mm, totally. Yeah.
Climate change is an important one. I've made this point a lot to people, because with it's I think climate scientists are nearly unanimous, right, on climate change. But when you see the 97% number trotted out, it's something like that 3% is actually non-climate scientists. So, they have a valid perspective, but some of them dissent from the consensus because that's not actually where their expertise is. And so, it, and that aside, I think all of these consensus issues are definitional problems. I think a lot of the intellectual conflicts we have get boiled down to definitional problems. Like I would never participate in a debate that's like capitalism versus socialism, which is the typical kind of framing, right? Because it's just each side can distort the definition to their liking, and it's too reductionist. But if we can build a consensus around the definition of some of these ideas, like climate change, for example, then yeah, you would hope you can go through it point by point and kind of eliminate the areas of ignorance that actually cause divergence.
Totally. Assuming the divergence is the result of ignorance, yes.
Right. Assuming it's all provable, it's all above board,
Right.
because ultimately it comes back to like these, Enlightenment principles and free speech and stuff. And do we actually want to see them played out to their logical conclusion or not? And so, there's just an enormous amount of denial built into the system and into our jobs to really miss these more subtle, obscure points. And, we're interested in a paradigm shift, right? We talk about metamodernism as indicative of that. And so I think you can't have a paradigm shift. You can't even have that conversation if we're not thinking about the ways that there's going to be a new normal, right? A new plateau of understanding. And it does come back fundamentally to things like education, right? So this is something, you understand deeply that there is actually ways we can universalize and, for lack of a better word, standardize education, quality education access to help foster this kind of paradigm shift. Because there's no paradigm shift without the actual kind of the tipping point of mass ideology itself, going towards this cosmoerotic future, secular humanism, whatever we want to call it. Right now, the needle is, the pendulum is swinging more towards fascism, and it needs to go the opposite direction to education.
Totally. This will be my last bit because then I got to run here.
Okay.
But, you're right. I mean, that was because people have been talking about a paradigm shift since the 60s or 70s. What limits to growth was 1972, and then you get dynamic systems theory, and then you get the overthrowing of Newtonian physics and chaos theory, and you get a bunch of stuff that basically says, hey, the reductive kind of like models of high modernity are way too simple, and they're actually a self-terminating protocol, as Schmachtenberger would say, and this whole thing is screwed unless we get a new way of thinking and being. So we've known that, and there have been some educational experiments along those lines, but there haven't been widespread educational changes that would actually remove the ceiling on hierarchical complexity around age 20, right? Which is what is necessary, that there's actually a transformation in the dynamics of socialization that would allow for the paradigm to become the new normal, as opposed to becoming something that gets reached by a rare few who pop out the top of the educational system, like despite it, and end up being transdisciplinary. So that question of how to down propagate that very highly complex actual paradigm changes necessary into curricula that would make it something like the new normal for socialization. This is a huge issue. Now, rewind to what I said about the actual environment of contemporary socialization, which isn't just not that. And to say like it's high modernist, like it's now nothing. It's now nihilism, and deeper than materialism, in the terms of just raw confusion. So the conspicuous absence of meta-narrative as the core of socialization, which is to say that there's no story of universe or planet or species that galvanizes. Instead, there's some other absence of that, which is to say, like an absence that you can feel, the confusion, the palpableness of it. And that's why I think the longing for consensus is a longing for that, of living again in a shared meta narrative that doesn't exclude, as many as or anybody, and then that gives narratives of universe and planet and species and power and community and the things we need common stories about in order to actually function and cooperate as a species. And again, that's all a socialization, education dynamic at this point. So yeah, we do seek this kind of metamodern renaissance, if you will. And like I'll end on where I've been harping the whole time, which is like, and it begins with somehow changing the media of communication and fixing, reclaiming, rolling back the capture of the informational landscapes by extractive surveillance capitalism, and somehow making that potential of the digital actual. Like what we're seeing now is some weird version of the digital. It's not the real potential of the digital. So that is one of the places that it begins. Again, the deep metapolitical move, which would make different conditions for the possibility of political discourse itself, as opposed to working with political discourse that's given. We need to work on the under laboring of all of that. And until we do that, then, the youth are captured by the screen. And that's just going to get worse and worse.
Yeah, a lot of youth are also, being subversive and taking advantage of it. So we shouldn't write them off. I think there's a resilience there.
We're trying to protect them so that they can have agency.
Yeah. The point I want to close on then is, just to give myself a plug, another thing that consensus is being built around is modern monetary theory. That's something I included in my recent articles for Thomas Bjorkman. And so, that's an interesting thing for us to talk about another time, I think. But, I want to close with a word that's popped into my head throughout this conversation, and that's evil. Because there's a certain evil to what's happening, right? And the way, Hannah Arendt defines the banality of evil, right, vis-a-vis World War II, the Holocaust and all that, is just ordinary people going with the flow and following orders. And there's a lot of that going around. And so, evil in one sense kind of isn't real. It's kind of metaphysical, ephemeral thing, but there's obviously, like, we don't put all the burden on the individual, right? There's systemic factors, but there's a certain evil happening that is rooted in ignorance, just like it was in World War II. It's this kind of the unfolding of history. It can't stop itself. And, we touched on the police state and all these sorts of things. I wish people took this more seriously in the spiritual sense, and in the concrete political sense, because it really is, criminally negligent and evil at all levels that we continue to participate in it. So, this concept that I'm developing more and writing about and going to talk with John Vervaeke next month is metanoia. Because a large part of that, it's not reducible to one thing, but a large part of that is guilt and repentance. And so individually and as a society, there is a ton of atonement and reckoning that needs to happen for the Cold War, for the war on terror, for slavery, for indigenous genocide, and for the ongoing kind of neoliberal abstraction that actually alienates and atomizes people. it's a type of evil when you confront it head on, and it comes from the depths, but it is enacted through our apathy and ignorance.
Well, yeah, I mean, I believe in the ontic reality of love. I've written about that in my work on metaphysics.
The opposite of evil.
And so I definitely also think evil is not just ephemeral, that you're looking at a very complex emergent factor in the evolution contingent upon the dynamics of free human choice and its perversion. And it comes back to, again, the mass psychology of fascism by Reich, right? What are the things that warp human choice to such an extent that both the banality of evil and the intensity of raw, violent evil become real human potentials? And so, yeah, I wouldn't shy away from the metanoia, which is necessary to that. And of course, the language I would use is a language that allows us to all lose face together, right? That it's not like they over there need to atone. Like we're the pure ones without sin, they need to atone. It's like, no. We all need to lose face together. And so if you look at history, if you look at enough history, it's like, for example, not just the white people who were bad. And if you look at enough history, you realize that there's been conspicuous evil throughout it. And it's also not about ending evil. It's about continually grappling with it. And then, of course, to bring Vervaeke in, to make meaning of the suffering and the tragic structure that characterizes life on Earth and always has. And even in a world where the social miracles were realized, even in that world, death, disease exists, right? Heartbreak exists, mistake exists, and even things like evil exist, which often occur from the radical distortion of the basis of your choice, which is to say, like a certain kind of capture or possession or wounding of the soul. And so what I'm saying is, like, yeah, confronting evil, looking at it with your eyes open, not thinking it's something that's not, but knowing that there are other, metaphysical entities out there aside from evil. So the only response to evil is actually love, and specifically loving the evil people, which is a weird thing to say. Doesn't mean not killing them if they come at you, by the way, because that could be a huge release on their part. But it does mean loving the evil people and actually loving the evil within yourself, which gets to shadow work and other aspects of the dynamics of human nature, which contains the potential for evil in all people, especially in those people who think they're not capable of evil and who accuse other people of doing evil. So you gotta watch out. And you mentioned miracles and like people who believe in them and things of that nature. And as someone who does a lot of spiritual practice, including prayer practice, there needs to be a lot more care for the soul. And we're so swamped by images in the dynamics of our lives, and we're so kind of captured by meta narratives that kind of release us from concrete obligations often. And so, I've said this before, but like, I'm not super interested in like saving the world or saving American politics, but the notion of saving souls actually makes a lot of sense to me. So on that note,
sounds good. Thanks for the conversation. And I may be a misanthrope a lot of the time, but it's motivated by a deep love for humanity. So peace, love, thanks, Dr. Zak Stein, and we'll catch you later.
Right on.